The phone call came during our family's annual Christmas dinner at Grandma's house in Millbrook. Your Honor, I'm so sorry to disturb you on the holiday, but we have an emergency hearing Monday morning. The defendant is, well, it's your sister, Cassandra Whitmore. She's facing felony embezzlement charges. My nephew was opening presents in the next room while my sister sat across from me, still smirking about my pathetic minimum wage job she'd mocked just hours earlier. But Cassandra had no idea that her little sister, who worked nights at the courthouse, wasn't a janitor like she assumed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Juliana Whitmore, and at 29, I had just received the most awkward phone call in judicial history. While my older sister was probably planning to lecture me again about my lack of ambition and dead-end career, she was about to discover that the family disappointment she'd been condescending to for years was actually the youngest federal judge appointed in our state's history. Let me take you back to how this all started, because the irony of this situation had been building for exactly 3 years, ever since I'd accepted my appointment to the bench in the Northern District Court of Hazleton. The Whitmore family dynamics had always been complicated, but they'd become particularly toxic since our parents passed away in a car accident 5 years ago. Cassandra, 4 years my senior, had inherited Dad's real estate empire and our mother's trust fund, instantly becoming Millbrook's self-appointed queen bee. She lived in a sprawling mansion on Magnolia Hill, drove a white Tesla, and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone about her success. I, on the other hand, had chosen a different path. After graduating summa cum laude from Hazleton Law School, I'd clerked for Justice Patricia Holloway at the state Supreme Court, then spent 2 years as a federal prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime. When President Morrison nominated me for the federal bench at age 26, it made national news as one of the youngest judicial appointments in decades. But here's where the story gets interesting. I'd never told my family about the appointment. You see, federal judges are required to avoid any appearance of impropriety or bias. When I learned that Cassandra's real estate company, Whitmore Holdings, was under investigation by the FBI for potential money laundering through her property flips, I made the difficult decision to keep my new position secret from my family. The last thing I needed was accusations of family influence affecting my judicial decisions. So, when Cassandra asked about my new job, I simply said I worked at the courthouse. When she pressed for details, I mentioned night shifts and building maintenance. She'd laughed, assuming I'd become a custodian, and I never corrected her assumption. Let her think what she wanted. I had cases to hear and justice to serve. For 3 years, this arrangement worked perfectly. Cassandra believed her little sister was a cleaning lady, making minimum wage, struggling to pay rent on a tiny apartment downtown. She'd slip me $100 bills at family gatherings, making grand gestures about how helping family, while reminding everyone present how successful she'd become compared to her disappointing younger sister. The truth was far different. My judicial salary was substantial, and I'd purchased a beautiful craftsman home in Riverside District under a trust to maintain privacy. I drove a modest Honda to family events because luxury cars felt inappropriate for a judge, but Cassandra interpreted this as evidence of my financial struggles. During holiday dinners, she'd regale the family with stories of her latest business triumphs while making passive-aggressive comments about people who settled for menial work and lacked the drive to better themselves. She'd suggest I apply for jobs at her company, offering to put in a good word for administrative positions that paid barely above minimum wage. Julie, honey, you're smart enough. You just need to think bigger. Stop limiting yourself to that courthouse cleaning job and join the real world. Our extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, had all bought into Cassandra's narrative. Poor little Juliana, the college graduate who somehow ended up pushing a mop for a living. They'd nod sympathetically when Cassandra explained how she'd tried to help me find real work, but I was apparently too proud or stubborn to accept her generous offers. The most painful part wasn't the condescension. It was watching how she treated other people she considered beneath her social status. Restaurant servers, store clerks, actual courthouse maintenance staff when she had to visit for property permits. She spoke to them the same way she spoke to me, with barely concealed disdain wrapped in fake politeness. 3 months ago, that attitude had finally caught up with her. The FBI's investigation into Whitmore Holdings had uncovered a sophisticated embezzlement scheme. Cassandra had been systematically inflating property values, hiding income from the IRS, and using her company as a front for money laundering from some very questionable sources. When federal agents raided her office in September, they found evidence of crimes totaling over $2 million. I'd recused myself from any cases involving Whitmore Holdings the moment I learned about the investigation. Judge Harrison Palmer was assigned to handle all related matters, ensuring there would be no conflict of interest. As far as the legal system was concerned, Juliana Whitmore, the federal judge, and Cassandra Whitmore, the defendant, were complete strangers.
But now, sitting at Christmas dinner watching my sister cut into Grandma's famous honey ham while complaining about having to hire a lawyer for some ridiculous government harassment, I knew the secret I'd maintained for 3 years was about to explode. The emergency hearing had been scheduled because Cassandra had violated her bail conditions. According to the court clerk who'd called, she'd been caught attempting to transfer additional assets to offshore accounts, a direct violation of the asset freeze order Judge Palmer had imposed. Tomorrow morning, Cassandra would walk into courtroom 3B expecting to argue her case before some anonymous federal judge. Instead, she'd find herself standing before her little sister, the minimum wage courthouse janitor she'd been mocking for years, wearing the black robes of the United States District Court. As I watched her laugh with our cousins about her lawyer's confidence that the charges would be dropped, I couldn't help but think about the expression she'd have when her attorney addressed me as Your Honor for the first time. The irony was almost perfect. Cassandra had spent years condescending to someone she thought was financially struggling, never realizing she was insulting a federal judge who earned more in a month than she claimed I made in a year. Now, that same judge would be presiding over the legal proceedings that would determine whether she spent the next decade in federal prison. Justice, as they say, has a sense of humor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 3 years earlier, when I'd first been sworn in as a federal judge, I'd stood in the marble halls of the Hazleton Federal Courthouse with tears in my eyes, thinking about how proud our parents would have been. Mom had always encouraged my love of justice and fairness, while Dad had taught me that true strength came from serving others, not dominating them. They'd raised both Cassandra and I with the same values, but somewhere along the way, my sister had chosen a very different path. Growing up, Cassandra and I had been close. She was the confident older sister who protected me from schoolyard bullies, while I was the studious younger one who helped her with homework. We dreamed together about changing the world. She wanted to build beautiful homes for families, and I wanted to ensure justice for everyone. Our parents had been so proud of both their daughters' ambitions. But wealth had changed Cassandra. When she inherited Dad's Riverside Realty Company and Mom's trust fund, totaling nearly $3 million, she'd transformed from a caring big sister into someone I barely recognized. She'd expanded the business aggressively, renamed it Whitmore Holdings, and began treating everyone around her as either useful or expendable. The contrast between our paths couldn't be straker. While Cassandra was buying her mansion on Magnolia Hill and her collection of luxury cars, I was living modestly in a studio apartment near the law school, working nights at a legal aid clinic to help families facing eviction. When she was throwing lavish parties for Millbrook's elite, I was studying constitutional law and writing briefs for cases involving corporate malfeasance. My appointment to the federal bench had come through a rigorous process. After my clerkship with Justice Holloway, I'd spent 2 years as an assistant U.S. attorney specializing in financial crimes and public corruption cases. My conviction rate was among the highest in the district, and I'd earned a reputation for being both fair and uncompromising when it came to holding powerful people accountable for their actions. When Judge Margaret Thornfield announced her retirement, President Morrison's Judicial Selection Committee reviewed hundreds of candidates. My name surfaced after I'd successfully prosecuted 3 major embezzlement cases involving local politicians and business leaders. The nomination process was intense. FBI background checks, Senate hearings, extensive vetting of every case I'd ever worked on. During my confirmation hearing, Senator Patricia Reynolds had asked me a question that would prove prophetic. Judge Whitmore, how will you handle cases where you might have personal knowledge of the parties involved? Senator, justice requires absolute impartiality. If any personal relationship or knowledge could compromise my ability to be fair, I would recuse myself immediately. The integrity of the court must always come before personal considerations. Those words would become crucial when I learned about Cassandra's legal troubles. The first sign that something was wrong with Cassandra's business came during Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. She'd been unusually defensive when our cousin Marcus asked about her rapid expansion, snapping that not everyone needed to understand high-level business strategies. When Uncle Robert mentioned reading about increased federal oversight of real estate transactions, Cassandra had gone pale and quickly changed the subject. I thought it was just stress from managing a growing company. What I didn't know was that the FBI had already begun monitoring unusual cash transactions flowing through Whitmore Holdings, large deposits from shell companies, property sales with inflated values, and a pattern of financial activity that raised red flags with federal investigators. As a federal judge, I received weekly briefings on ongoing investigations in my district. When I saw Whitmore Holdings listed in a money laundering probe 6 months ago, my heart had stopped. I immediately contacted the Chief Judge's office to discuss potential conflicts of interest.
Chief Judge Williams had been understanding, but firm. Juliana, you'll need to recuse yourself from any matters involving your sister's company. We'll assign those cases to Judge Palmer. And given the sensitive nature of this situation, I'd recommend maintaining complete confidentiality about your position until the investigation concludes. That conversation had sealed my decision to continue letting Cassandra believe I was a courthouse janitor. It wasn't just about protecting myself professionally, it was about ensuring that justice could proceed without any appearance of family influence or bias. The irony was that Cassandra's condescending attitude toward my supposed minimum wage job made the deception easier to maintain. She was so convinced of her own superiority that she never questioned why I seemed knowledgeable about legal procedures, or why I could afford my modest but comfortable lifestyle on what she assumed was a custodial salary. During family gatherings, she'd make comments like, "Juliana, you really should consider going back to school. With your intelligence, you could probably get an administrative job at a law firm. I know several attorneys who might give you a chance." The patronizing tone in her voice always made my teeth clench, but I'd learned to respond with grateful smiles and non-committal murmurs. What Cassandra didn't realize was that while she saw my work clothes, the simple blouses and conservative skirts I wore to family dinners, she never saw my judicial robes. She never witnessed me presiding over complex federal cases, making decisions that affected people's lives and livelihoods. She had no idea that attorneys across the state knew my name, that my legal opinions were cited in law journals, or that I'd been featured in Rising Stars of the Federal Judiciary in Legal Times magazine. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. At Christmas dinner, she'd lecture me about setting realistic goals and not being too proud to accept help. While just the week before, I'd presided over a case involving a Fortune 500 company accused of securities fraud. The company's legal team had included some of the most prestigious attorneys in the country, and they'd addressed me with the respect and deference due to a federal judge. But perhaps the most painful part of maintaining the secret was watching how Cassandra treated people she considered beneath her social status. During family dinners at restaurants, she'd snap at servers, complain loudly about service, and often left insulting tips while making sure everyone noticed her generosity toward me. She'd talk down to store clerks, dismiss parking attendants, and generally behave as if anyone earning less than six figures was somehow less worthy of basic human respect. This attitude extended to how she spoke about my supposed coworkers at the courthouse. "Those janitors and security guards Julie works with," she'd say with a dismissive wave, "they're probably nice enough people, but they have no ambition, no drive to better themselves." What she didn't realize was that I had tremendous respect for the courthouse staff. Martha Henley, the head of building services, had worked there for 30 years and knew more about the practical functioning of the federal court system than most attorneys. Security Chief James Peterson was a retired police detective who'd solved more crimes than half of the prosecutors who appeared before me. These were dedicated professionals who kept the wheels of justice turning, and Cassandra's casual dismissal of their value revealed everything about her character. The final straw had come 3 months ago when Cassandra had actually visited the courthouse to file paperwork for a property tax dispute. I had been in my chambers reviewing case files when Martha knocked on my door. "Judge Whitmore," she said with an amused expression, "there's a woman downstairs who claims to be your sister. She's being rather rude to the staff and insisting she needs to speak with whatever janitor named Juliana works here. She says it's a family emergency." I looked through the security monitor to see Cassandra in the lobby, tapping her foot impatiently while berating the receptionist about minimum wage workers who think they're too important to come when called. The scene had been mortifying, not because of any embarrassment about my supposed job, but because of how she was treating people I worked with every day. That evening, when Cassandra called to complain about her courthouse experience, she ranted for 20 minutes about incompetent government employees and the attitude problem of people who work menial jobs. She'd concluded with, "Julie, I tried to visit you at work today, but your coworker said you were busy. I hope you're not developing the same entitled attitude as the rest of them." I'd simply apologized and promised to be more available next time, while privately making a note to commend the reception staff for their professionalism in dealing with my sister's behavior. Now, sitting at Christmas dinner, watching Cassandra hold court about her legal troubles and her confidence that money and connections always win in the end, I couldn't help but think about tomorrow's hearing. She'd be walking into a courtroom where money and connections meant nothing, where only facts and law mattered, and where the person in the black robes had spent years learning to see through exactly the kind of entitled behavior my sister had perfected. The little sister she'd dismissed as a failure was about to become the most important person in determining her future. And unlike the family dinners where I'd swallowed my pride and accepted her condescension, in that courtroom, there would be no question about who held the power.
The pattern of Cassandra's betrayal hadn't emerged overnight. Looking back now, I could trace the systematic erosion of our relationship to specific moments when her success had gradually transformed her from a loving sister into someone who viewed me as a charity case and social embarrassment. It had started subtly after our parents' funeral 5 years ago. During the reading of their will, Cassandra had inherited the bulk of their estate, the real estate business, investment accounts, and the family home, while I received a modest trust fund designated for education expenses and Mom's jewelry collection. At the time, the arrangement seemed fair. Cassandra was the older daughter who'd always shown interest in Dad's business while I was still in law school with uncertain career prospects. But Cassandra's attitude toward me had shifted almost immediately after the probate was finalized. The sister who used to call me for advice about everything from relationships to career decisions suddenly began treating me like a well-meaning but ultimately naive younger sibling who needed guidance about real-world matters. The first warning sign came during Thanksgiving dinner 6 months after Mom and Dad's accident.
Cassandra had arrived in a brand new BMW, wearing designer clothes and sporting a Rolex that cost more than most people's annual salary. When our cousin Jennifer commented on her obvious prosperity, Cassandra had launched into a detailed explanation of her business expansion plans, complete with condescending remarks about people who settled for jobs instead of building wealth. The difference between success and mediocrity, she'd announced to the assembled family, is understanding that you have to take calculated risks. Most people are too comfortable in their safe little jobs to ever achieve anything meaningful. Her eyes had found mine across the table as she said this, and I'd realized with growing discomfort that she was positioning herself as the family's success story while implicitly casting me as the cautionary tale. Over the following months, this dynamic had intensified. Cassandra began inserting herself into conversations about my career with increasingly inappropriate suggestions and unsolicited advice. When I mentioned working late at the prosecutor's office, she'd shake her head sympathetically and suggest I was being taken advantage of by people who would never truly appreciate my dedication. "Julie, sweetie," she'd say with that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "You're so smart and hardworking, but you need to think strategically about your future. Working for the government is fine for gaining experience, but the real money is in private practice. I could introduce you to some attorneys who might be willing to take a chance on someone with your background." The irony was staggering. Cassandra, who'd inherited her wealth and had never worked for anyone but herself, was lecturing me about career strategy while I was gaining experience that would eventually lead to one of the most prestigious appointments in the federal judiciary. But the most painful betrayal had been how she'd begun treating my life choices as evidence of some fundamental character flaw. When I declined her offers to help me find better employment, she'd started describing me to extended family as stubborn and too proud to accept help. She'd created a narrative where my commitment to public service was actually a form of self-sabotage, and my reluctance to take her advice proved I lacked ambition. The gaslighting had been particularly insidious. Cassandra would make cutting remarks about my lifestyle, then frame them as loving concern. "I worry about you, Julie," she'd say after criticizing my modest apartment or my secondhand car. "You're settling for so much less than you deserve. I just want to see you happy and successful." When I tried to explain that I was happy with my career choices, she dismissed my feelings with a wave of her hand. "You say that now, but wait until you're 40 and still struggling to pay your bills. You'll regret not listening to me when you had the chance to build something real." The most infuriating part was how she'd convinced our extended family that her treatment of me was actually generosity. At family gatherings, relatives would compliment Cassandra on how good she was to me, how patient she was with my unrealistic idealism, and how wonderful it was that she kept trying to help me despite my apparent ingratitude. Cassandra had become masterful at public displays of sisterly concern that were actually exercises in humiliation. She'd slip me cash at family dinners, making sure everyone noticed her generosity while simultaneously reinforcing the narrative that I needed financial assistance. She'd offer to pay for my meals at restaurants, insisting loudly that family takes care of family while ensuring every server and nearby diner understood that I couldn't afford to pay for myself. The manipulation extended to how she discussed my living situation. Cassandra would express concern about my tiny apartment in that questionable neighborhood, conveniently omitting that I'd chosen the location because it was a 5-minute walk from the courthouse and that the building was actually a beautifully renovated historic property. She described my lifestyle as making do with so little, while ignoring the fact that I was deliberately living modestly to maintain the financial discipline I'd learned from our parents. Perhaps most troubling was how Cassandra had begun using our parents' memory to justify her behavior toward me. She'd claimed that mom and dad would have wanted her to look out for me, that they'd be worried about my career choices, and that they'd expect her to guide me toward more practical decisions. She'd appropriated their legacy to support her narrative that success meant wealth accumulation and social status, conveniently forgetting that our parents had always emphasized service, integrity, and treating all people with dignity regardless of their economic circumstances.
The financial condescension had escalated over the past 2 years. Cassandra had started making increasingly grandiose offers of assistance, each one designed to emphasize the gap between our supposed circumstances. She'd suggested paying for me to attend real estate seminars, offered to co-sign a lease on a better apartment, and even proposed hiring me as an assistant at Whitmore Holdings with a salary that was actually lower than what I earned as a federal prosecutor. "I could create a position for you," she'd explained during last year's Christmas dinner, speaking as if she were offering me a lifeline rather than an insult. "Administrative work, filing, maybe some basic bookkeeping. Nothing too complicated, but it would be steady income with benefits. You could finally move out of that apartment and start building a real future." The offer had been particularly galling because Cassandra knew I had a law degree. She'd attended my graduation, had seen my academic achievements, and was fully aware of my capabilities. Yet she was offering me a clerical position that would have been appropriate for someone with a high school education and no professional experience. When I'd politely declined, explaining that I was committed to my current career path, Cassandra had sighed dramatically and turned to our assembled relatives. "You see what I'm dealing with? I keep trying to help, but Julie is determined to struggle rather than accept assistance. I don't know what else I can do." The comment had stung not just because of its content, but because of how effectively it had painted me as the unreasonable one in our relationship dynamic. Cassandra had positioned herself as the generous older sister, and me as the stubborn younger one who was too proud or too foolish to accept her wisdom. The psychological manipulation had become so sophisticated that I'd occasionally found myself questioning my own perceptions. Was I being too proud? Was my commitment to public service actually a form of self-limitation? Were Cassandra's criticisms motivated by genuine love rather than condescension? But then I'd remember the way she spoke to restaurant servers, the dismissive tone she used when discussing anyone in a service industry job, and the obvious pleasure she took in being seen as the successful sister helping the struggling one. Her treatment of me wasn't loving concern. It was a systematic campaign to establish and maintain a hierarchy that served her ego. The final confirmation of this pattern had come 6 months ago when Cassandra had organized a family reunion at her mansion. She'd insisted on giving tours of her home, making sure everyone saw her marble bathrooms, her walk-in closet filled with designer clothes, and her 3-car garage housing vehicles worth more than most people's homes. During the tour, she'd made a point of discussing how she'd earned everything through smart business decisions and refusing to settle for mediocrity. Then, in front of 30 family members, she'd pulled me aside for what she called a heart-to-heart conversation. "Julie," she'd said with performative concern, ensuring her voice carried to nearby relatives, "I've been thinking about your situation and I'm really worried. You're almost 30 and you're still living like a college student, working nights, barely scraping by, no real prospects for advancement. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your future." She'd gone on to suggest that my resistance to change was holding me back, that my attachment to unrealistic ideals was preventing me from building wealth, and that my pride was keeping me from accepting the help I obviously needed. The entire conversation had been a masterclass in public humiliation disguised as sisterly intervention. What Cassandra couldn't have known was that 3 days earlier, I'd presided over a federal case involving a major embezzlement scheme remarkably similar to what the FBI would later discover at Whitmore Holdings.
As I'd listened to her lecture about my lack of business acumen and poor financial decisions, I'd been thinking about the defendant in that case, a successful real estate developer who'd believed his wealth and social connections would protect him from consequences. He'd been wrong. And as I'd watched Cassandra hold court about her business success while treating me like a charity case, I'd wondered if she was making the same mistake. The arrogance, the sense of entitlement, the belief that rules applied to other people, all the warning signs had been there. Now, sitting at Christmas dinner, listening to her dismiss the federal charges against her as harassment and political persecution, I realized that Cassandra's treatment of me over the past 3 years hadn't just been personal betrayal, it had been a window into her character, a preview of how she viewed anyone she considered beneath her station. Tomorrow, she would discover that the sister she'd spent years condescending to was actually someone who understood exactly how the federal justice system worked, someone who'd seen countless defendants with her same attitude of entitlement face the consequences of their actions. The pattern of betrayal was about to meet the pattern of justice, and Cassandra was completely unprepared for what was coming. What Cassandra didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that 3 years ago at age 26, I had become the youngest person ever appointed to the federal bench in the Northern District of Hazleton. While she was busy building her real estate empire and perfecting her condescending lectures about my lack of ambition, I was quietly establishing myself as one of the most respected jurists in the state.
The appointment had come through a rigorous selection process that began when I was still working as an assistant U.S. attorney. My specialization in financial crimes had put me on the radar of the Justice Department's Judicial Selection Committee, particularly after I'd successfully prosecuted a series of high-profile embezzlement cases involving prominent business leaders who thought their wealth and connections made them untouchable. The case that had really caught national attention involved Harrison Blackstone, a real estate mogul from the state capital who'd been systematically defrauding investors for over a decade. Blackstone had operated with the same arrogance I would later recognize in Cassandra, the absolute certainty that his social status and political connections would shield him from consequences. He'd been wrong, and my prosecution had resulted in a 20-year federal sentence that sent shockwaves through the business community. When President Morrison's team began vetting candidates for the federal bench, my name surfaced repeatedly in discussions about prosecutors who had the courage to hold powerful people accountable. The background investigation had been exhaustive. FBI interviews with colleagues, professors, law school classmates, even high school teachers. Every case I'd ever worked, every legal brief I'd written, every decision I'd made as a prosecutor was scrutinized with microscopic attention to detail. The confirmation process itself had been a surreal experience. Sitting before the Senate Judiciary Committee, fielding questions from senators about my judicial philosophy and my commitment to impartial justice, while knowing that my sister viewed me as a failure who cleaned buildings for minimum wage. Senator Patricia Reynolds had been particularly thorough in her questioning about my ability to handle cases involving financial crimes and wealthy defendants. "Ms. Whitmore," she'd asked during my confirmation hearing, "you've built your career prosecuting white-collar criminals, many of whom come from privileged backgrounds. How will you ensure that your personal experiences don't create bias in your judicial decisions?" My answer had been carefully considered. "Senator, justice requires that we judge actions, not circumstances. Whether a defendant is wealthy or poor, powerful or powerless, they deserve the same fair application of the law. My experience prosecuting financial crimes has taught me that corruption thrives when people believe they're above accountability. As a judge, I would ensure that no one, regardless of their status, receives special treatment." Those words would prove prophetic when I learned about the FBI investigation into Whitmore Holdings. The irony of my situation had crystallized 6 months after my appointment, when I'd received my first briefing about ongoing federal investigations in my district. Sitting in my chambers, reviewing the classified documents that outlined various cases under investigation, I'd seen the name Whitmore Holdings listed under suspected money laundering operations. My initial reaction had been disbelief. Surely there was some mistake, some other company with a similar name. But as I read the details,
the address of the company headquarters on Riverside Avenue, the name of the principal owner, the description of suspicious financial transactions. There had been no doubt. My sister was under federal investigation for crimes that could result in decades in prison. The ethical implications had been immediate and complex. Federal judges are required to recuse themselves from any case where they have a personal interest or relationship with the parties involved. But this wasn't just about recusal. This was about a fundamental conflict between my family relationships and my judicial responsibilities. I'd immediately contacted Chief Judge Williams to discuss the situation. Margaret Williams had been a mentor to me throughout my career, first when I'd clerked for her predecessor, and later when I'd worked in the prosecutor's office. Her advice had been characteristically direct and uncompromising. Juliana, this is exactly the kind of situation that tests judicial integrity. You need to recuse yourself from any matter involving your sister's company, obviously, but more than that, you need to ensure that your family has no knowledge of your position until this investigation concludes. Any appearance that information flowed from you to them could compromise not just your career, but the entire judicial system's credibility. The decision to maintain my secret had been painful but necessary. I'd spent years working toward this appointment, and I wasn't going to let family complications destroy my ability to serve justice impartially. More importantly, I'd recognized that my sister was potentially facing serious criminal charges, and any suggestion that she'd received advance warning or favorable treatment because of her relationship to a federal judge would be devastating to both of us. So I'd continued letting Cassandra believe I worked as a custodian at the courthouse. The deception had been surprisingly easy to maintain. Federal judges often work odd hours, reviewing cases and writing opinions late into the evening. When family members asked about my schedule, I'd simply mentioned working nights at the courthouse, which was technically true. When they asked about my responsibilities, I'd been vague about building maintenance and security-related duties, which wasn't entirely false if you considered maintaining the integrity of the judicial system as a form of institutional maintenance. The real challenge had been listening to Cassandra's patronizing advice about my career while knowing that I held one of the most prestigious positions in the legal profession. During family dinners, when she'd lecture me about thinking bigger and not settling for menial work, I'd bite my tongue and remember that my commitment to justice required this temporary sacrifice of personal dignity.
My judicial colleagues had been understanding about my need for privacy regarding family matters. Federal judges often maintain separation between their personal and professional lives, and my request to keep family visits to the courthouse to a minimum hadn't raised any eyebrows. Court security had been discreetly briefed that if anyone claiming to be my sister attempted to visit, they should be politely informed that I was unavailable, without revealing any details about my actual position. The closest call had come 8 months ago, when Cassandra had actually visited the courthouse to handle some routine property tax paperwork. I'd been in my chambers when Martha Henley, the head of building services, had knocked on my door with an amused expression. "Your Honor," she said with barely suppressed laughter, "there's a woman downstairs who says she's your sister. She's asking to speak with the janitor named Juliana, and getting quite frustrated with our reception staff for not immediately producing you." Through the security monitors, I'd watched Cassandra berating the courthouse employees, demanding to know why they couldn't simply call me to the front desk. Her tone and attitude toward the staff had been embarrassing, particularly since these were people I worked with daily and respected enormously. I'd instructed security to inform Cassandra that I was unavailable due to work responsibilities, which was true. I'd been reviewing briefs for a complex securities fraud case scheduled for the following week. The irony hadn't been lost on me that while Cassandra was downstairs complaining about incompetent government employees, I was upstairs preparing to preside over a case involving crimes remarkably similar to those she would later be charged with. That evening, when Cassandra had called to complain about her courthouse experience, she'd spent 20 minutes ranting about the attitude problem of federal employees and the bureaucratic inefficiency that prevented her from speaking with her sister during work hours.
She'd concluded the conversation by suggesting that I should be more assertive with my supervisors about personal emergencies, apparently believing that custodial staff should have more flexibility in their schedules. What Cassandra hadn't realized was that federal judges have tremendous autonomy in managing their time and responsibilities. I could have walked downstairs and spoken with her at any point, but doing so would have risked exposing my true position and potentially compromising the investigation into her company. The weight of maintaining the secret had been enormous. There had been countless moments when I'd wanted to defend myself against her condescension, to reveal that her assumptions about my career and capabilities were completely wrong. But each time I'd felt tempted to respond to her patronizing comments, I'd remembered the oath I'd taken as a federal judge, to administer justice without respect to persons and to do equal right to the poor and to the rich. That oath meant that Cassandra's crimes, if proven, would be judged on their merits rather than on our family relationship. It meant that justice would be blind to the fact that she was my sister, just as it would be blind to her wealth and social status. But it also meant that I had to recuse myself from her case entirely, ensuring that she received the same fair treatment as any other defendant. Judge Harrison Palmer had been assigned to handle all matters related to Whitmore Holdings when the indictments were filed 3 months ago. Palmer was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his unwillingness to be swayed by wealth or political pressure. Exactly the kind of judge Cassandra would need for a fair trial, regardless of whether she was guilty or innocent. But now, with tomorrow's emergency hearing scheduled due to Cassandra's violation of her bail conditions, I knew the secret I'd maintained for 3 years was about to explode in the most dramatic way possible. The sister who'd spent years lecturing me about my lack of ambition was about to discover that her minimum-wage sibling was actually a federal judge with the power to send people to prison for decades. As I sat at Christmas dinner, listening to her confident predictions about how her case would be dismissed because federal judges understand the business world, I couldn't help but think about the expression she'd have when she realized that one of those federal judges was sitting right across from her, quietly finishing her slice of Grandma's apple pie. The hidden advantage was about to become unhidden indeed. The morning after Christmas dinner, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. with a knot in my stomach and a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in 3 years. Today wasn't just about Cassandra's emergency hearing. It was about ensuring that justice proceeded exactly as it should, without any interference from our family relationship or my personal feelings about her behavior. My first call was to Chief Judge Williams at 6:15 a.m. Margaret answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the early hour. Federal judges learn to function on minimal sleep, and emergency situations don't wait for convenient timing. "Juliana," she said before I could speak, "I've been expecting your call. Judge Palmer briefed me last night about the bail violation. Your sister attempted to transfer an additional $800,000 to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, despite explicit court orders freezing her assets. The amount was staggering, but at the timing that revealed everything about Cassandra's mindset. She'd made these transfers on Christmas Eve, apparently believing that federal monitoring systems would be reduced during the holiday. It was exactly the kind of entitled thinking that got her into this situation in the first place."
Margaret, I said, settling into my home office chair while reviewing the secure case files I'd requested the night before, "I need to discuss something that could complicate today's proceedings. Cassandra still has no idea about my position. She believes I work as a custodian at the courthouse." There was a long pause before Margaret responded. "That's actually remarkable. How have you maintained that deception for 3 years?" I explained the family dynamics, Cassandra's condescending assumptions, and my decision to let her believe what she wanted rather than risk compromising the investigation. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making notes that I could hear through the phone. "This creates an interesting ethical situation," she finally said. "Your sister will be appearing before Judge Palmer today, not you. But if she discovers your true position during or after the hearing, it could impact her future legal strategy or public statements about the case. We discussed the implications for nearly 30 minutes. The consensus was clear. I needed to maintain my recusal from any involvement in Cassandra's case while ensuring that the revelation of my judicial position didn't create grounds for appeal or claims of prosecutorial misconduct. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. I would attend today's hearing as a family member in the public gallery, making no attempt to hide my presence or my identity, but taking no action that could influence the proceedings. Let Judge Palmer handle the case on its merits, Margaret advised. If your sister discovers who you are during the hearing, that's simply an unfortunate family situation, not a judicial conflict. Just make sure you're not involved in any way with the actual legal proceedings. After hanging up with Margaret, I spent 2 hours reviewing the case files that had been provided for my background knowledge. As a federal judge, I maintained security clearance that allowed me access to ongoing investigations within my district, though I was strictly prohibited from taking any action related to Cassandra's case. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The FBI had traced a complex money laundering scheme that had been operating for nearly 3 years, with Whitmore Holdings serving as a front for washing funds from various illegal sources. Shell companies in Delaware and Nevada had been created to purchase properties at inflated values, with the excess funds being funneled back to offshore accounts controlled by Cassandra. But the recent activity that had triggered yesterday's emergency hearing, despite being released on a $2 million bond with strict conditions prohibiting any financial transactions above $10,000, Cassandra had attempted to move nearly $1 million to the Cayman Islands using a series of cryptocurrency transactions she'd apparently believed were untraceable. The sophistication of the scheme was impressive, but the arrogance behind it was breathtaking. Cassandra had violated her bail conditions using methods that created digital trails leading directly back to her personal accounts. It was as if she'd believed that her wealth and social status would somehow overlook obvious criminal activity. By 8:30 a.m., I was dressed in my most conservative business attire, a navy blue suit that would be appropriate for someone attending court as a family member, but wouldn't draw attention or suggest any special status. I'd learned during my time on the bench that clothing choices in federal court carried significant meaning, and I wanted to ensure that nothing about my appearance suggested I was anything other than a concerned sister. The drive to the Hazleton Federal Courthouse took 20 minutes through morning traffic. As I pulled into the public parking garage, I felt the surreal nature of the situation settle over me. In 3 years as a federal judge, I'd never attended a hearing as a spectator. I'd always been the person in the black robes, presiding over proceedings and making decisions that affected people's lives. Today, I would be sitting in the gallery like any other family member, watching someone else determine my sister's fate. Security at the courthouse was routine, but thorough. I passed through the metal detectors alongside other visitors, exchanging polite nods with the security officers who knew me professionally but maintained appropriate discretion about my identity. James Peterson, the security chief, caught my eye briefly and gave an almost imperceptible nod of understanding. He knew why I was there, but his professional demeanor revealed nothing. Courtroom 3B was already filling with spectators when I arrived at 9:15 a.m. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m., but federal criminal proceedings often attracted public interest, particularly when they involved prominent local figures. I chose a seat in the back row of the gallery, positioning myself where I could observe the proceedings without drawing attention. At 9:45 a.m., Cassandra arrived with her legal team. I'd researched her attorney, Douglas Fitzgerald, the night before. He was a prominent criminal defense lawyer from the state capital with a reputation for representing wealthy clients accused of white-collar crimes. His track record was impressive, but he specialized in negotiating plea agreements rather than winning trials, a practical approach for clients who were typically guilty of the charges against them. Cassandra looked confident as she took her seat at the defense table. She dressed for court in an expensive black suit with pearl accessories, projecting an image of respectability and wealth. Her posture and expression suggested she viewed this hearing as an inconvenience rather than a serious legal proceeding that could determine whether she spent the next decade in federal prison. What struck me most was how completely unchanged she seemed. Despite being under federal indictment for embezzlement and money laundering, despite violating her bail conditions in a way that demonstrated continued criminal activity, Cassandra carried herself with the same entitled confidence she'd displayed at Christmas dinner just 18 hours earlier.
At 9:58 a.m., the bailiff called the courtroom to order. All rise. The Honorable Judge Harrison Palmer presiding. Judge Palmer entered from his chambers with the measured pace that characterizes federal proceedings. At 62, Harrison was one of the most respected jurists in our district, known for his meticulous attention to detail and his unwillingness to be swayed by political pressure or social status. His reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for defendants who showed disrespect for the judicial process. As Palmer took the bench and instructed everyone to be seated, I found myself in the strange position of observing judicial proceedings from the perspective of a family member rather than a colleague. The familiar rituals of federal court, the formal language, the careful procedures, the atmosphere of serious deliberation felt different when viewed from the gallery. "We're here this morning," Judge Palmer began, "to address allegations that the defendant, Cassandra Whitmore, has violated the conditions of her pretrial release by engaging in prohibited financial transactions." The prosecution's case was presented by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Morrison, a prosecutor I'd worked with during my time in the U.S. Attorney's office. Rachel was thorough and methodical, walking through the evidence of Cassandra's attempted asset transfers with the precision that had made her one of the most effective financial crimes prosecutors in the district. "Your Honor," explained Rachel, displaying bank records on the courtroom screens, "on December 24th, at approximately 2:30 p.m., the defendant initiated a series of cryptocurrency transactions designed to transfer $789,000 to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. These transactions were executed using methods specifically intended to evade federal monitoring systems." As Rachel continued her presentation, I watched Cassandra's expression gradually shift from confidence to concern. The evidence was overwhelming. Digital records, bank statements, cryptocurrency wallet addresses, all creating an undeniable paper trail of her bail violation. What she'd apparently viewed as a clever way to protect her assets before trial had actually created additional federal crimes that could add years to her potential sentence. Douglas Fitzgerald attempted to minimize the violations, arguing that his client had been trying to protect legitimate business assets from what he characterized as government overreach. But his arguments sounded hollow in the face of such clear evidence of deliberate deception. "Your Honor," Fitzgerald said with the practiced sincerity of a defense attorney fighting an uphill battle, "Miss Whitmore was simply attempting to preserve business assets necessary for her defense. She had no intention of fleeing the jurisdiction or avoiding trial." Judge Palmer's response was swift and decisive. "Mr. Fitzgerald, your client violated explicit court orders by transferring funds to offshore accounts using methods designed to evade detection. This demonstrates not only disrespect for this court's authority, but ongoing criminal activity that directly contradicts the conditions of her release." As the hearing progressed, I found myself studying Cassandra's reactions from my position in the gallery. The confident woman who'd lectured me about business success and financial strategy was gradually realizing that her wealth and social connections couldn't protect her from the consequences of her choices. But what I found most revealing was her complete lack of understanding about the seriousness of her situation. Even as Judge Palmer outlined the additional charges she could face for violating her bail conditions, Cassandra maintained the same entitled expression she'd worn at family dinners when dismissing my career choices. She still didn't understand that in federal court, justice was truly blind to wealth, social status, family connections, and all the advantages that had protected her in the business world. and she had absolutely no idea that her minimum wage sister was sitting 20 feet behind her, watching the very system of justice she'd devoted her career to work exactly as it was designed to. The strategic response I had chosen was perfect in its simplicity. Let justice proceed without interference, and let Cassandra discover the truth about her assumptions when reality finally caught up with her arrogance. Judge Palmer's decision came swiftly and without mercy. Miss Whitmore, based on the evidence presented today, I find that you have willfully and deliberately violated the conditions of your pretrial release. Your bail is hereby revoked, and you will be remanded to federal custody pending trial. The words hit Cassandra like a physical blow. For the first time since I'd been watching her from the gallery, her composed facade cracked. Her face went pale, and she gripped the edge of the defense table as if the room were spinning around her. Your Honor, Douglas Fitzgerald immediately stood. His voice carried the controlled desperation of a defense attorney fighting an uphill battle. We respectfully request that my client be allowed to remain free on modified bail conditions. Miss Whitmore has significant ties to the community and poses no flight risk. Judge Palmer's expression remained impassive. Mr. Fitzgerald, your client has just demonstrated that she poses exactly the kind of risk that pretrial detention is designed to prevent. She violated explicit court orders by attempting to move nearly $800,000 offshore using cryptocurrency transactions specifically designed to evade federal monitoring systems. This behavior shows a pattern of deliberate deception and ongoing criminal activity that directly contradicts the conditions of her release.
The bailiff approached the defense table as Judge Palmer continued. Furthermore, the defendant's financial resources and demonstrated willingness to engage in complex international money transfers make her an unacceptable flight risk. Bail is revoked, effective immediately. As the bailiff moved to place handcuffs on Cassandra, she twisted around to scan the courtroom gallery. Her eyes swept across the assembled spectators, journalists, legal observers, and family members, searching for friendly faces or support. When her gaze reached the back row where I sat, her expression shifted from panic to confusion, then to something approaching hope. "Julie!" she called out, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "Julie, thank God you're here! Tell them about my business, about what I've built. They don't understand that this is all a misunderstanding." The entire courtroom turned to look at me. Judge Palmer paused the proceedings, his eyes following Cassandra's gaze to where I sat in my conservative business suit. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, I met my sister's desperate stare while feeling the weight of 3 years of deception pressing down on me. Douglas Fitzgerald looked confused, clearly uncertain who Cassandra was addressing or why she thought a spectator in the gallery could somehow influence federal criminal proceedings. The prosecutors at their table exchanged glances, probably wondering if this woman in the back row was somehow connected to their case in ways they hadn't anticipated. Judge Palmer's voice cut through the tension. "Miss Whitmore, this court does not permit outbursts from defendants or communications with spectators during proceedings. If you have character witnesses or evidence to present, your attorney can file appropriate motions through proper channels." But Cassandra wasn't listening to Judge Palmer anymore. Her attention was entirely focused on me, her eyes pleading for the kind of rescue she'd grown accustomed to expecting from family connections. "Julie, please, you work here. You know these people. You can explain that this is all a misunderstanding." The irony of the moment was devastating. Cassandra was asking me to use my courthouse connections to help her, never imagining that my connections included the authority to send people to federal prison for decades. She thought she was appealing to a janitor for help with building maintenance staff, not realizing she was looking at a federal judge who understood exactly how serious her crimes were. Douglas Fitzgerald finally grasped what was happening and moved quickly to control the situation.
Your Honor, my client is understandably distraught. I apologize for the disruption and ask that we proceed with the remand proceedings. As the bailiff completed the handcuffing process, Cassandra continued to stare at me with desperate confusion. "Julie, do something! Use your job here to help me! Please!" Judge Palmer had clearly had enough. "Bailiff, please escort the defendant to the holding area. Mr. Fitzgerald, you have 48 hours to file any appeals regarding the bail revocation. This hearing is adjourned." As Cassandra was led away in handcuffs, she turned back one more time to look at me. The expression on her face was one I'd never seen before. Vulnerability mixed with genuine terror as she realized that the entitled world she'd inhabited for the past 5 years was crumbling around her. For the first time since our parents' death, she looked like the sister I remembered from childhood, rather than the condescending stranger she'd become. The courtroom began to empty, but I remained seated in the back row processing what had just occurred. Cassandra had been taken into federal custody, facing charges that could result in a 20-year sentence, and her final act of desperation had been to appeal to the sister she'd spent 3 years dismissing as a failure. Douglas Fitzgerald was packing his briefcase when he noticed me still sitting in the gallery. After a moment of apparent internal debate, he approached my row. "Excuse me," he said with professional politeness. "I'm Douglas Fitzgerald, Miss Whitmore's attorney. I couldn't help but notice that my client seemed to know you. Might I ask what your relationship is to Miss Whitmore?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. This was the moment when 3 years of carefully maintained deception would either continue or explode entirely. I could simply identify myself as Cassandra's sister and let Douglas figure out the implications later, or I could reveal the truth that would fundamentally change how everyone involved viewed this case. "I'm her sister," I said simply, standing to gather my purse and coat. Douglas looked relieved, probably assuming he'd found a potential character witness or source of family support for his client. "I see. And you work here at the courthouse?" The courthouse was emptying around us, but several people remained within earshot: court reporters, clerks, and other attorneys who'd been observing the hearing. My answer would either preserve the fiction that had protected both Cassandra and I for 3 years, or it would create the kind of courtroom drama that would be discussed in legal circles for decades. "I'm a federal judge," I said quietly.
The words hit Douglas Fitzgerald like a physical blow. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a kind of sick understanding of the impossible situation he'd stumbled into. "You're what?" he whispered, apparently hoping he'd misheard. "Federal Judge Juliana Whitmore, Northern District of Hazleton," I replied with the calm professionalism that had served me well during 3 years on the bench. "I've been recused from all matters involving Whitmore Holdings since the investigation began. Judge Palmer is handling your client's case entirely independently." Douglas Fitzgerald sank into the nearest chair, his face pale as he processed the implications. "Dear God," he muttered. "Cassandra has no idea, does she?" "None whatsoever," I confirmed. "She's believed for 3 years that I work as a custodian here. I never corrected her assumption because it simplified the ethical complications of our family relationship while she was under investigation." The defense attorney stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling to process the surreal nature of the situation. His client had just been taken to federal detention while begging her sister, a federal judge, to use her courthouse connections to help her escape justice. "This is," Douglas began, then stopped, apparently unable to find words adequate to the situation. "Ironic? Appropriate? Justice served?" As I walked toward the courtroom exit, I could feel Douglas Fitzgerald's stunned gaze following me. Behind me, I heard him quietly say to no one in particular, "She's going to lose her mind when she finds out." The confrontation I'd been preparing for mentally over the past 3 years had finally occurred, though not at all in the way I anticipated.
Instead of a dramatic revelation during family dinner or a private conversation where I could control the narrative, the truth had emerged in the most public and devastating way possible. Cassandra was now sitting in a federal detention cell, probably still believing that her janitor sister had somehow failed to help her when she needed it most. Soon, very soon, Douglas Fitzgerald would have to explain to his client that the family member she'd been condescending to for years was actually a federal judge who could have sent her to prison for decades if she hadn't properly recused herself from the case. The expedition I'd been preparing mentally for the past 3 years had finally occurred, though not at all in the way I anticipated. Instead of a dramatic revelation during family dinner or a private conversation where I could control the narrative, the truth had emerged in the most public and devastating way possible. Cassandra was now sitting in a federal detention cell, probably still believing that her janitor sister had somehow failed to help her when she needed it most. Soon, very soon, Douglas Fitzgerald would have to explain to his client that the family member she'd been condescending to for years was actually a federal judge who could have sent her to prison for decades if she hadn't properly recused herself from the case. The expedition I'd been preparing mentally for the past 3 years had finally occurred, though not at all in the way I anticipated.
The mention of my name had apparently caused Cassandra's entire demeanor to shift. For the first time since her arrest, she'd shown something approaching vulnerability. "Julie?" she'd said, her voice softening. "Yes, I saw her at the hearing yesterday. I tried to get her attention, but she seemed distant. I suppose she's upset about my situation. She's always been sensitive about legal matters, probably because she doesn't understand how the business world actually works." Douglas had paused then, reportedly struggling with how to explain the impossible reality of the situation. "Cassandra, your sister isn't a janitor." The simple statement had apparently hit her like a physical blow. "What do you mean? Of course she is. She works nights at the courthouse doing building maintenance. She's been struggling financially for years. I've been helping her out with money whenever I can." "Your sister," Douglas had continued with the methodical precision of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis, "is federal judge Juliana Whitmore. She's been a federal judge for 3 years. She's one of the youngest people ever appointed to the federal bench in this state." The silence that followed had stretched for nearly 2 full minutes, according to the detention facility's log. Cassandra had stared at her attorney as if he'd begun speaking a foreign language, her expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and dawning horror. "What do you mean?" "Of course she is. She works nights at the courthouse doing building maintenance. She's been struggling financially for years. I've been helping her out with money whenever I can." Douglas had pulled out his phone and shown her my official judicial biography from the Northern District Court website, complete with my appointment photo and professional credentials. The photograph showed me in my judicial robes, standing in front of the courthouse where Cassandra had visited just months earlier, demanding to speak with the janitor named Juliana. The realization had apparently broken something fundamental in Cassandra's understanding of reality. According to the report, she had begun hyperventilating, repeating, "No, no, no," while staring at the photograph of her sister in federal judicial robes. "She's been lying to me for 3 years," she had gasped between breaths. "Everything she told me was a lie. The janitor job, the financial struggles, the night shifts, all of it was lies."
Douglas had attempted to explain the ethical reasons for my deception, the necessary recusal from her case, and the importance of maintaining judicial independence from family influences. But Cassandra hadn't been listening. She had been too busy processing the devastating implications of what she had just learned. "Every family dinner," she'd muttered, apparently talking to herself rather than her attorney. "Every time I gave her advice about her career, every time I offered her entry-level positions at my company, every time I lectured her about thinking bigger. She was already a federal judge. She was already more successful than I'll ever be." The psychological impact had been immediate and severe. Douglas reported that Cassandra had cycled through denial, anger, and crushing embarrassment within the span of minutes. She had apparently recalled specific conversations where she had condescended to me about legal matters, offered me entry-level positions at her company, and made disparaging comments about government employees, all while speaking to a federal judge who had been too professional to correct her assumptions. "The courthouse visit," she had whispered, the memory apparently hitting her with a particular force. "When I went there to file the tax paperwork and demanded to speak with a janitor named Juliana, the reception staff must have thought I was insane." Douglas had confirmed that, yes, the courthouse employees had found her behavior both puzzling and inappropriate, particularly since they all knew exactly who she was asking for and why her request was so absurd. But the worst realization had come when Cassandra understood the full implications of her courtroom outburst the previous day. She had begged her federal judge sister to use her courthouse connections to help her, never imagining that those connections included the authority to preside over criminal cases exactly like hers. "She was sitting there watching me get arrested," she had said, her voice hollow with understanding. "She watched me get handcuffed and taken away, and I was begging her to help me because I thought she was a janitor." The psychological breakdown had been so complete that the detention facility's medical staff had been called to evaluate whether Cassandra needed psychiatric intervention. The cognitive dissonance of learning that 3 years of assumptions had been completely wrong, combined with the stress of facing federal criminal charges, had created a crisis that transcended her legal troubles. But it was what happened next that truly revealed the depth of Cassandra's character flaws. After the initial shock had worn off, her reaction hadn't been shame or self-reflection about how she had treated me. Instead, she had become furious about the deception itself. According to Douglas, she had spent the remainder of their meeting ranting about how I had betrayed her by lying about my career, how I had manipulated the situation to make her look foolish, and how my deception proved that I was vindictive and calculating. "She deliberately let me make a fool of myself," she had raged, apparently unable to recognize the irony of her complaint. "She sat there for 3 years listening to me give her career advice when she already had one of the most prestigious jobs in the legal profession. She wanted me to look stupid." Douglas had attempted to explain that my deception had been motivated by ethical requirements and the need to avoid conflicts of interest in her case. But Cassandra had rejected these explanations, instead constructing a narrative where I was the villain who had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to humiliate her.
"This explains everything," she declared with the certainty of someone who'd found a conspiracy theory that explained all her problems. "She knew about the investigation before it became public. She probably helped them build the case against me. This whole prosecution is revenge for some imagined slight from years ago." The paranoid thinking had escalated from there. Cassandra had demanded that Douglas file motions alleging prosecutorial misconduct, judicial bias, and violation of her constitutional rights based on my knowledge of her case. She'd insisted that my presence at the hearing the previous day had been a deliberate intimidation tactic designed to influence Judge Palmer's decision. Douglas had patiently explained that none of these theories had any legal merit, that my recusal from her case was exactly what judicial ethics required, and that my attendance at the hearing as a family member was completely appropriate. But Cassandra had been beyond rational argument. "You don't understand," she told her attorney with the same condescending tone she'd used with me for years. "This is personal. This isn't about justice. It's about my sister getting revenge for imagined slights. She's been planning this for years." The conversation had concluded with Cassandra demanding that Douglas contact media outlets to expose what she called the judicial conspiracy against her. She'd apparently believed that public pressure could somehow override federal criminal law and force the dismissal of charges against her. Douglas had declined to pursue any of these strategies, leading to a heated argument that ended with Cassandra threatening to fire him and represent herself if he wouldn't fight the real enemy in her case. When Chief Judge Williams briefed me on this conversation later that afternoon, her expression had been a mixture of professional concern and personal sympathy. "Juliana," she said after reviewing the detention facilities report, "your sister appears to be having some kind of psychological crisis. The realization about your position has triggered what seems to be a complete break from reality regarding her legal situation." The irony was devastating. Cassandra had spent 3 years condescending to me about my lack of understanding of how the real world works, while completely failing to understand how the criminal justice system actually operated. Now, faced with the consequences of her crimes, she was constructing elaborate conspiracy theories rather than accepting responsibility for her actions. Her desperate escalation wasn't just about avoiding accountability for her crimes. It was about preserving the narrative she'd constructed about herself as the successful sister and me as the failure. Learning that this narrative was completely false had shattered something fundamental in her psyche, and she was lashing out at everyone around her rather than confronting the truth about her own behavior. The sister who'd lectured me about strategic thinking and business acumen was now pursuing legal strategies that would guarantee her conviction, all because she couldn't accept that my assumptions about her had been wrong for 3 years. As I sat in my chambers that evening, reviewing the day's events, I realized that Cassandra's desperate escalation was actually the most predictable outcome possible. She'd spent years believing that wealth and connections could solve any problem, that rules applied to other people, and that her success made her superior to those around her. Now, faced with a system that truly didn't care about her money or status, she was doubling down on the same entitled thinking that had gotten her into this situation in the first place. The revelation about my judicial position hadn't humbled her. It had simply provided her with a new target for blame and a fresh conspiracy theory to avoid confronting her own responsibility. Tomorrow would bring new developments in her case, and based on tonight's report, they wouldn't be developments that served her legal interests. Cassandra was spiraling into increasingly desperate behavior, and every choice she made was only making her situation worse. 3 weeks after Cassandra's meltdown in federal detention, Douglas Fitzgerald made the difficult decision that would ultimately save his client from herself. He contacted Chief Judge Williams to request an emergency competency evaluation, citing concerns about Cassandra's ability to assist in her own defense. The psychological evaluation, conducted by Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in cases involving wealthy defendants facing their first serious legal consequences, revealed a disturbing pattern. Cassandra wasn't suffering from any diagnosable mental illness, but she was experiencing what Dr. Chen termed reality adjustment disorder, an inability to process information that contradicted her fundamental beliefs about how the world operated. Ms. Whitmore appears to be psychologically incapable of accepting that federal criminal law applies to her in the same way it applies to other defendants, Dr. Chen had written in her report. The competency hearing was held in Judge Palmer's courtroom on a gray February morning. I attended again as a family member, sitting in the same back row where I'd witnessed Cassandra's arrest 3 weeks earlier. This time, however, she knew exactly who I was when her eyes found mine across the courtroom. The look she gave me was filled with such concentrated hatred that it made my chest tighten. This wasn't the confused desperation I'd seen during her arrest. This was pure, focused rage directed at someone she now viewed as the architect of her downfall. Dr. Chen's testimony was clinical and devastating. The defendant demonstrates a persistent pattern of grandiosity thinking and an inability to process information that challenges her self-perception. She continues to insist that the evidence against her has been fabricated as part of a family conspiracy, despite overwhelming documentation of her criminal activity. Douglas Fitzgerald had done his best to prepare Cassandra for this hearing, but his efforts had been futile. When Judge Palmer asked her directly about her understanding of the charges against her, Cassandra's response revealed the complete break from reality that Dr. Chen had documented. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she'd used at family dinners, "these charges are the result of a coordinated attack by my sister, who has used her position as a federal judge to orchestrate this prosecution as revenge for personal grievances dating back to our childhood." Judge Palmer's expression remained neutral, but I could see him making notes as Cassandra continued her delusional explanation of her legal situation. "The evidence has been selectively interpreted and possibly fabricated," she declared with absolute conviction. "My sister has access to federal investigators and has clearly influenced their findings. This entire prosecution is tainted by her personal animosity toward me." Douglas tried to interrupt his client, but Cassandra waved him off with the same dismissive gesture she'd used countless times when I'd attempted to contribute to family conversations. "Furthermore," she continued, apparently oblivious to how her words were affecting everyone in the courtroom, "I demand that Judge Palmer recuse himself from this case due to his obvious bias in favor of my sister's position in the federal judiciary. The entire Northern District Court is compromised by family politics masquerading as criminal justice." The silence that followed Cassandra's statement was profound. Judge Palmer set down his pen and studied her for a long moment before responding. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, with the careful patience of someone addressing a particularly challenging defendant, "I want to ensure that you understand something clearly. Judge Juliana Whitmore recused herself from any involvement in your case specifically to avoid any appearance of impropriety. She has had no contact with the prosecution team, no access to evidence in your case, and no influence over these proceedings whatsoever." Cassandra's response revealed how completely she'd lost touch with reality. "That's exactly what someone would say if they were part of the conspiracy," she replied, with the confidence of someone who'd solved a complex puzzle. "The recusal itself is proof of the coordination between my sister and this court." Dr. Chen, sitting in the witness box, made additional notes while observing this exchange. Later, she would describe Cassandra's reasoning as hermetically sealed against contradictory evidence, a psychological defense mechanism that interpreted any information challenging her conspiracy theory as proof of the conspiracy's existence. Judge Palmer made his ruling swiftly. "Based on Dr. Chen's evaluation and the defendant's statements in open court, I find that Ms. Whitmore is competent to stand trial, but is engaging in behavior that is detrimental to her own legal interests. Mr. Fitzgerald, I strongly encourage you to discuss plea negotiations with the prosecution." The plea negotiations that followed were a study in cognitive dissonance. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Morrison offered Cassandra a deal that was remarkably generous considering the evidence against her. Guilty pleas to 2 counts of money laundering in exchange for a recommended sentence of 5 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years. For someone facing potential life imprisonment on the original charges, it was an extraordinary offer. But Cassandra rejected it immediately, not because she wanted to fight the charges in court, but because accepting a plea would require admitting guilt, and admitting guilt would mean acknowledging that her crimes were real rather than fabricated. "I will not legitimize this persecution by accepting any plea agreement," she told Douglas during a meeting that he later described to Chief Judge Williams as surreal. "Accepting a plea would be admitting that my sister's vendetta has merit, which it absolutely does not." Douglas had spent hours trying to explain that plea negotiations had nothing to do with family dynamics and everything to do with the overwhelming evidence of her criminal activity. But Cassandra had constructed a worldview where acknowledging her guilt would somehow validate what she perceived as my betrayal, making a rational legal decision psychologically impossible. The final straw came when Cassandra attempted to file pro se motions, representing herself without an attorney, alleging judicial misconduct by every judge in the Northern District, prosecutorial misconduct by the U.S. Attorney's Office, and civil rights violations by the FBI. The motions were poorly written, legally baseless, and filled with accusations that read more like conspiracy theories than legal arguments. Judge Palmer denied all of her motions in a written order that was both legally thorough and personally devastating. The defendant's allegations of misconduct are not supported by any credible evidence. Instead, they appear to be the product of an inability to accept responsibility for well-documented criminal behavior. 2 weeks later, facing a trial date where the evidence against her was overwhelming and her defense strategy consisted entirely of conspiracy theories, Cassandra finally reached the breaking point. Douglas received a call from the detention facility informing him that his client wanted to discuss plea options. The conversation, held in the same attorney-client meeting room where Cassandra had first learned about my judicial position, was markedly different from their previous interactions. The angry defiance had been replaced by exhausted resignation. "How long would I serve?" she asked Douglas, her voice barely above a whisper. "With the prosecution's current offer, probably 3 to 4 years. But Cassandra, you need to understand that this offer won't remain available indefinitely. If we go to trial and lose, you're looking at 15 to 20 years minimum."
The mathematics of the situation had finally penetrated her psychological defenses. 3 years in federal prison was a devastating consequence, but it was survivable. 20 years would effectively end her life as she'd known it. "What would I have to say?" she asked, referring to the allocution, the formal admission of guilt required as part of any plea agreement. Douglas explained that she would need to acknowledge her crimes in open court, describe her actions in detail, and accept responsibility for violating federal law. For someone who'd spent months insisting that her prosecution was a family vendetta, this represented a complete psychological capitulation. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following week. Judge Palmer's courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and members of the business community who'd followed Cassandra's case from the beginning. I attended as I had throughout the proceedings, sitting in my usual spot in the back row. When Judge Palmer asked Cassandra to describe her crimes, her response was barely audible. "I used my real estate company to launder money from illegal sources," she said, reading from a prepared statement. "I created false documents, inflated property values, and moved funds to offshore accounts to avoid detection by federal authorities." The admission took less than 5 minutes, but it represented the complete destruction of the narrative Cassandra had constructed about herself over the past 5 years. The successful businesswoman who'd lectured family members about financial strategy had been revealed as a criminal who'd built her wealth through fraud and deception. Judge Palmer accepted the plea agreement and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. As Cassandra was led back to detention, she looked toward the gallery one final time. Her eyes found mine, but instead of the hatred I'd seen during the competency hearing, her expression was hollow, defeated. The federal sentencing guidelines called for 42 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and restitution of $2.3 million to the victims of her crimes. Judge Palmer's sentence was exactly what the plea agreement had specified, no more, no less. Cassandra's empire was dismantled systematically. Whitmore Holdings was dissolved, its assets seized to pay restitution and fines. The mansion on Magnolia Hill was sold at auction, along with her cars, jewelry, and business investments. The woman who'd spent 3 years condescending to me about my financial struggles was now facing bankruptcy and federal prison. But perhaps the most fitting aspect of her downfall was how completely it vindicated the values our parents had tried to instill in both of us. They'd taught us that success meant service to others, that integrity was more valuable than wealth, and that treating people with dignity was more important than accumulating social status. I'd built my career on those principles, choosing public service over private practice and judicial integrity over family loyalty when the two came into conflict. Cassandra had rejected those values in favor of wealth accumulation and social climbing, and now she was facing the consequences of choices that had prioritized money over morality. As I left the federal courthouse after her sentencing, I reflected on the strange justice of the situation. The sister who'd spent years telling me I needed to think bigger and be more ambitious was heading to federal prison, while the sister she'd dismissed as a failure had helped ensure that the justice system worked exactly as it was designed to do so. The final resolution wasn't about revenge or family drama. It was about the fundamental principle that no one, regardless of wealth or family connections, should be above the law. Cassandra had learned that lesson the hardest possible way, but she had learned it. 2 years after Cassandra began serving her sentence at Federal Correctional Institution Danbury, I received an unexpected letter at my chambers. The envelope bore the prison's return address, written in handwriting I recognized, despite not having seen it for over 3 years. Inside was a 5-page letter that would fundamentally change how I understood the aftermath of our family's destruction. The letter began with something I'd never expected to see from my sister: an unqualified apology. Juliana, I've spent the past 2 years in this place thinking about everything that happened, and I've finally reached a point where I can see clearly enough to admit the truth. You didn't betray me. You didn't orchestrate my downfall. You didn't manipulate federal investigators or coordinate with prosecutors. I destroyed my own life through greed, arrogance, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what success actually means. Reading those words in my chambers on a quiet Thursday morning, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of a recognition that people can change, even under the most difficult circumstances. The letter continued with details about Cassandra's experience in federal prison that revealed a transformation I wouldn't have thought was possible. She'd been assigned to work in the prison law library, helping other inmates research their cases and understand legal procedures. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The woman who'd spent years dismissing my legal expertise was now using what little legal knowledge she had absorbed to help others navigate the systems she once thought didn't apply to her. Working with these women has taught me something I should have learned years ago. Everyone here has a story, and most of them involve making terrible decisions when they felt trapped or entitled or desperate. But the difference is that most of these women take responsibility for their choices. They don't blame prosecutors or judges or family members. They're serving their time and trying to build something better for when they get out. The most striking part of the letter was her acknowledgement of how she had treated me during those 3 years when I had been serving as a federal judge while she believed I was a custodian.
"I've had a lot of time to remember specific conversations we had," she wrote. "And the memory of how I spoke to you makes me physically sick. The condescension, the lectures about thinking bigger, the offers of minimum wage jobs, all directed at someone who was already more successful than I ever was, even with all my inherited wealth. But worse than that was how I treated other people I considered beneath my social status. Restaurant servers, store clerks, courthouse employees. I see now that my treatment of you was just one example of a pattern that revealed everything about my character." She went on to describe her current perspective on the events that had led to her imprisonment, and her analysis was surprisingly clear-eyed. "I want you to know that I understand now why you couldn't tell me about your judicial position," she wrote. "You were protecting the integrity of the justice system, and you were protecting me from accusations that I'd received favorable treatment because of family connections. What I saw as deception was actually professionalism of the highest order. You sacrificed family harmony to ensure that justice could proceed fairly, and I'm grateful for that integrity even though it contributed to my conviction." The letter included updates about her daily routine that painted a picture of someone learning humility for the first time in her adult life. She'd been assigned to clean bathrooms and mop floors as part of her work detail, actual janitorial work that she performed without complaint. The woman who'd spent years mocking what she thought was my custodial job was now doing similar work herself, and she'd apparently gained a deep appreciation for the dignity of all labor. I understand now why you never corrected my assumptions about your work. You were comfortable with who you were and what you'd accomplished. You didn't need external validation or recognition. I mistook your confidence for lack of ambition because I couldn't imagine success that wasn't defined by wealth and social status. Perhaps most remarkably, Cassandra had used her time in prison to research our family history and had discovered information about our parents that neither of us had known. Through letters to elderly relatives and genealogical research, she'd learned that our father had actually started his real estate business with money borrowed from his own father, a man who'd worked as a courthouse janitor for 30 years before retiring. Our grandfather, William Whitmore, spent 3 decades cleaning the same courthouse where you now serve as a federal judge, she wrote. Dad never talked about Grandpa's work because he was embarrassed by it. But I've learned from our cousin Martha that Grandpa was proud of his job. He believed that keeping the courthouse clean was important work that served justice. When I read that, I realized that your supposed janitor job would have made Grandpa proud, while my actual criminal behavior would have devastated him. The historical irony was profound. Our family's wealth had originated with a man who'd performed the same type of work Cassandra had mocked me for, and I was now serving in the same building where our grandfather had spent his career maintaining the physical infrastructure that supported the rule of law. Cassandra's letter also included reflections on our extended family and how our situation had affected them. Several relatives had reached out to her since her imprisonment, and their reactions had apparently provided additional perspective on the damage her entitlement had caused. Cousin Robert told me that everyone in the family knew you were successful at something, even if they didn't know exactly what. They could see it in how you carried yourself, how you spoke about legal matters, how confident you were despite what they thought was financial struggle. He said they'd been waiting for years for you to reveal what you were really doing because it was obvious you weren't actually a custodian. The only person who couldn't see it was me, because I was too busy feeling superior to pay attention to evidence that contradicted my assumptions. The letter concluded with a section that revealed the depth of Cassandra's transformation and her plans for after her release. I've been accepted into a correspondence program through the University of Connecticut to complete a bachelor's degree in social work. When I get out in 8 months, I want to work with formerly incarcerated women who are trying to rebuild their lives. I'll never get back the wealth I had before, and I don't want to. That wealth was built on criminal activity and fed an arrogance that nearly destroyed me. Instead, I want to build something real, work that actually helps people rather than just enriching myself. She'd apparently been in contact with several of the victims of her money laundering scheme, working with a victim advocacy program to arrange restitution payments beyond what the court had required. I know money can't undo the harm I caused, but I want to do everything I can to repair the damage. Mrs. Henderson, who lost her retirement savings because of my crimes, has agreed to let me work with her financial advisor to help her rebuild her portfolio when I'm released. It's not about forgiveness. It's about responsibility. The final paragraph of her letter addressed our relationship directly, without expectations or demands. I don't know if you'll want to have any contact with me when I'm released, she wrote. I understand that what I did to you, the years of condescension, the public humiliation, the conspiracy theories after my arrest, may have damaged our relationship beyond repair. But I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm grateful that you maintained your integrity even when it meant letting me make a fool of myself. You're the kind of person our parents raised you to be, and I'm sorry it took federal prison for me to recognize that. After reading the letter twice, I sat in my chambers for nearly an hour processing its contents. The transformation Cassandra described seemed genuine, but I'd learned to be cautious about dramatic personality changes, particularly when they occurred under the pressure of incarceration. However, over the following months, I received verification of her claims from multiple sources. The prison chaplain wrote to thank me for my sister's work with literacy programs. Her social work professor forwarded copies of papers Cassandra had written about criminal justice reform and victim advocacy that demonstrated genuine insight and empathy. Most convincingly, 3 former inmates who'd been released wrote to describe how Cassandra had helped them understand their legal situations and prepare for re-entry into society. 6 months later, when Cassandra was released to a halfway house in Hartford, I made a decision that surprised even me. I drove to Connecticut to meet with her. Not for reconciliation exactly, but to see for myself whether the transformation she'd described was real. The woman I met in the common room of the Riverside Recovery Center bore little resemblance to the entitled businesswoman who'd been arrested 3 years earlier. She was thinner, her hair was gray at the temples, and she carried herself with a quietness that was completely different from her previous commanding presence. But what struck me most was how she interacted with the other residents, with genuine respect and attention that I'd never seen her show to people she considered beneath her social status. Our conversation lasted 2 hours and covered territory we'd never explored as adults. We talked about our parents' values, about the different paths we'd chosen after their death, and about the ways both of us had been shaped by wealth, me by choosing to reject its pursuit, her by being corrupted by its acquisition. I thought success meant accumulating wealth and power, she told me as we sat in the center small garden. I thought people who chose service over profit were naive or lacking in ambition. I never understood that true success might mean using your abilities to serve something larger than yourself. We also discussed the practical aspects of her reentry into society. Her criminal record would limit her employment options, and she'd lost her professional licenses in real estate and finance. But she'd already secured a position with a nonprofit organization that provided housing assistance to formerly incarcerated women, and she seemed genuinely excited about the work despite its modest salary. It pays $32,000 a year, she said, with a smile that was both rueful and genuine. 3 years ago, I would have considered that poverty wages. Now I see it as an opportunity to build something meaningful. As I drove back to Hazleton that evening, I reflected on the strange journey our family had taken. The sister who'd spent years mocking my supposed minimum wage work was now genuinely working for minimal wages by choice. While the sister she'd dismissed as a failure continued serving in one of the most prestigious positions in the American legal system. The final vindication wasn't about her downfall or my success. It was about the recognition that the values our parents had tried to instill in us had ultimately prevailed, even if it took federal prison for one of us to teach what they meant. Today, 3 years after Cassandra's release, she runs her own nonprofit organization helping formerly incarcerated women navigate reentry challenges. Her annual salary is less than I earn in a month, but she radiates a satisfaction and purpose that her millions never provided. We have dinner once a month now, and she never fails to address me as Your Honor when we're in public, not as mockery, but as genuine respect for the position I hold and the integrity it requires. The sister who once laughed at my minimum wage work now understands that the value of work isn't measured in dollars, but in its contribution to justice, service, and human dignity. Sometimes the greatest success stories aren't about rising to the top, but about falling far enough to finally understand what really matters. That understanding, hard-won through loss and humility, is worth more than all the wealth she used to possess.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.